Good afternoon. I'm Saskia Epstein, Client and Community Relations Director at PNC in New England, and a proud PNC certified women's business advocate. I'm excited about Women in Business Week with events all week long and to be here today hosting Women Moving Markets in collaboration with the Boston Globe. We've invited three amazing women leaders to talk about the influence of women in the economy, exploring social impact investing, and the power of women in the workplace and the marketplace. And there is no better leader to facilitate a conversation about women as a force for social change than Linda Henry, CEO of the Boston Globe. Joining Linda are Tracy Palangin, co-founder and CEO of Social Finance, and Betty Francisco, CEO of Boston Impact Initiative. Welcome. These three women are a force, and I know you'll enjoy listening to them as much as I will. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, and welcome to this Women Moving Markets event sponsored by PNC Bank. I'm Linda Henry, CEO of Boston Globe Media, and joining me today are two incredible women making a significant impact in our communities and beyond. Betty Francisco and Tracy Palangin. Welcome. Thank you both for coming together today at the Boston Globe's office. It is wonderful to be with you in person for what I know will be a really inspiring conversation about how both of you are helping economically empower women and other diverse communities of workers. Before we get started, I'm going to share a little bit about each of you. Betty Francisco is the CEO of Boston Impact Initiative, a social impact investment fund that invests in regenerative local enterprises in Eastern Massachusetts that are owned and controlled by entrepreneurs of color or are serving communities of color. She's also the co-founder of the Investors of Color Network, a consortium of Black and Latinx accredited investors working to close the racial funding gap in startup capital. And on top of that, she is a co-founder of Amplify Latinx, a social venture that is building Latinx economic and political powers. As the CEO and co-founder of Social Finance, Tracy Palangin works to build innovative partnerships and investments to measurably improve lives. Social Finance is a national impact finance and advisory nonprofit that has truly pioneered impact investments, including the Social Impact Bond and the Career Impact Bond that takes capital at scale and uses it to deliver sustainable impact in communities across the United States. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you and have both of you share a bit about your work in investing and how your personal experiences help shape how you make decisions as business and social leaders. And I'm going to start by asking each of you to share some of your perspective on the impact of the last 2 years on workers in general and women specifically. It's a big question to start with.
It is a huge question, and Linda, it's so great to be with you and so great to be with you, Betty. It's been tough, needless to say, and if you really think about the net job losses over the last 2 years, 2/3 of them have been suffered by women. Women and women of color, people from marginalized communities, they are really the first to suffer and the last to recover. And just to kind of go down in the women's statistics path, if you really look at the numbers and look at why women are dropping out of the workforce, there are really two major forces at play, right? One is that a lot of the industries that are massively affected by the pandemic are sectors that are overrepresented by women workers, right? Retail and hospitality and healthcare is a double-edged sword because we're also seeing a lot of people leave the healthcare workforce just because the last 2 years have been so challenging. At the same time, you're also seeing that women, all of us, are often have more familial responsibilities, more household responsibilities, unpaid work, if you will. And when childcare centers are closed, when schools are closed, that's also contributing to a lot of women leaving the workforce. So I think the statistic is that for women with children under 2 years of age, 42% of those women have left the workforce. So these are just crazy, crazy numbers. And as we're emerging out of the pandemic now, thinking about how to lift women have them acquire the skills to really get back into the workforce, have sustainable careers, and go up that economic mobility escalator is something that we at Social Finance have been really thinking a lot about and working on.
For a long time, I had wanted to transition from law because the folks that I was representing were mostly large corporations, VC investors, startups, which is all amazing. It was a great way to start off my career. But often what I saw in that sector was the lack of representation of both women, but also people of color. In fact, when I look back at my 8 years in private practice, that's how I started my career early on, there was only one transaction which had a female CEO. Wow. So that's pretty stark, right? At a time when there were so many biotech and tech companies being started. The landscape has changed a bit, obviously, because there's been an effort to get more women into these sectors. But that is what started to lead me down this journey of wanting to increase representation of women because I wasn't seeing them. And yet I was a woman in law, I was a woman in business, and I thought that opening the doors of opportunity for others that want to get into both the legal profession, but also into entrepreneurship. So one of the things that led to that was a program called Pipeline Angels, which I think you did as well.
I did.
And I did it in 2015, and at the time I had an interest in both taking all the learnings from law, right? So I was papering up all the transactions that my lovely VC investors were engaging in, and I often wondered, okay, how do they make those decisions? How do they decide who to invest in? And how do they cultivate those businesses for growth? And I started to see that there was such a lack of capital going to women entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs of color. And Pipeline's goal was to train more women to become angel investors so they in turn would invest in women-owned social ventures. So that program both gave me some of the skills, right, to begin investing personally, but also I think it's courage, right, to say I want to take the risk and put capital in to open those doors for women with amazing ideas. So that was part of I think the incentive, being able to invest as a group to de-risk, right, those investments was the starting point for me.
It's a remarkable story, and I remember the slogan is, and I'm sure you have a T-shirt that says, "This is what an angel looks like," which is sort of to change that. You also had a similar thing where you had an incredibly successful career in the private sector, and then you made this. You realized that this changed, and I'll get into it. I recently took a course where we studied social finance because it is such a new model. But what sort of showed you that there was a better way?
Well, I was probably less intentional than Betty, so I was just humming along, going down my private sector path. My career had mostly been in management consulting and asset management, having worked at McKinsey and Wellington Management at Parthenon, and all the while trying to bring up 3 amazing daughters. And social finance was almost an accidental journey, if you will. At the time, I was at the Parthenon Group, where I had spent almost 12 years before I started social finance. And in the back half of my time at Parthenon, I started really focusing on the nonprofit sector and launched and led the nonprofit practice at Parthenon. And during that journey, I started thinking about all the tools available to strengthen the social sector and to strengthen and build new models to drive social change. In that context, I met Social Finance in the UK, which was co-founded by Sir Ronald Cohen and David Blood. And it's one of these gifts in life that I now look back 12 years later and said, how lucky was I that I was presented with this opportunity to leave a fairly conventional private sector track and try to be a social entrepreneur. Not ever thinking that I would ever become a social entrepreneur until that moment. And it was a big decision for me. The kids were 8, 10, and 12 at the time when we got social finance going, and you can imagine, right? Like, as a working mom, it's like one foot ahead of the other every day, just for survival. And it was a big decision to become an entrepreneur because nothing in my life had prepared me for entrepreneurship. I didn't take Pipeline. And the idea that, not least starting a nonprofit, Social Finance is a 501c3, was a huge decision. But now looking back, it's one of the luckiest things that has ever happened to me because I've just never found, I've always enjoyed going to work, and it's always about problem solving and the camaraderie of colleagues. But for the last 12 years, I found something new about going to work, which is that your work matters, and it matters beyond you, the firm, your colleagues, and that feeling is something that is just incredibly special. So
I get it. You're winning at life if you not only love what you do, but really believe in what you're doing. And I want to stay with you for 1 minute because I want to talk about what needs. So that was sort of a big change that you were brave enough to take. But what need did you see social finance fulfilling that wasn't already being done?
It's an excellent question. Linda, if you look at all our social challenges facing us, whether it's disparity in education, widening income inequality and wealth inequality, the persistent challenge of homelessness, we talked about early childhood earlier. Many leaders across sectors have been trying to focus on solving these problems. And whether it's philanthropy or government, there's actually quite a bit of capital going into solving these problems. Yet, these problems remain intractable. And sometimes we see ourselves even going backwards in some of these statistics, income inequality being a leading one. And so social finance's theory of change, not to be wonky, if you will, is that there are great ideas and great capital going into solving social challenges, yet sometimes the incentives aren't aligned, or money is being spent on outputs instead of outcomes. Take, for example, the United States at the federal, state, and local level spends over $1 trillion in all kinds of social programs, after-school reading programs, homeless assistance programs, reentry programs, at all the different levels of government. And back around 12 years ago when Peter Orszag, when he was running the CBO, did an audit on how this money is actually being spent. And in his book called Moneyball for Government, he states that less than 1% of that money spent by government actually produced measurable outcomes. Why? Because our government procures services in a way that's very output oriented. So when they are trying to fund a job training program, they'll study how many hours are people in the classroom, what are the teacher-student classroom ratio, and they don't really think about what actually happens to the participants a year out of the program, 3 years out of the program. So we're really trying to think about directing funding toward outcomes instead of outputs, but also not just redirecting public funding flows, but also finding new creative ways to enlist the capital markets to solve problems through impact investments, and we can talk about impact investing. I know this is also Betty's trade, but also mixing capital from philanthropy, from the public sector, and from the capital markets in new creative ways that mitigates risks for participants and align the incentives to really achieve outcomes at scale. And we can go into examples. It's super theoretical, but
well, it's
yeah.
Your examples are not theoretical. But can you talk more, Betty, about the impact investing that you're doing? Sort of how you've targeted and focused. So I think this is a really great example of sort of identifying what the problem was. And when you made your career change, you identified what the problem was. And so, how are you investing and sort of galvanizing investors to address this?
Sure. Well, there's a whole spectrum of impact investing, and it starts sort of with philanthropy at the one end, right? Think of it as negative zero return grants, philanthropic giving, all the way to full market rate returns, investing in venture funds, PE funds, the stock market, and those can have an impact, right? So it depends on your sector, right? It could have an impact on the environment, the types of investments you're making. Now there's a whole, exiting from fossil fuels and things that harm the environment. So impact is I think sometimes a subjective term, and there's a whole movement in the ESG realm to try to put some metrics on it and some definitions so there's clarity around what we really mean by environmental, social, and governance impacts. At Boston Impact Initiative, which is where I currently am, and I was very attracted to that particular fund. One is because it's set up as a nonprofit charitable loan fund. So it's a nonprofit impact investment vehicle like yours. And I, at the time, didn't know these types of funds existed, right? So they're—
Explain how it works.
Sure. So it is a nonprofit, and its focus, its mission is to invest in regenerative social enterprises in Eastern Massachusetts. We're a place-based fund, but what's unique is that we invest integrated capital. So for us, integrated capital is equity, debt, and grants. It's the whole spectrum of products in the financial services space, because when you think about the life cycle of a small business, at one point it might need a grant to get started. Eventually it could graduate up to some debt, and then it could need equity investment. And with equity, there are different products. It may have revenue. So we come across a lot of businesses with revenue, but they have inconsistent revenue. It ebbs and flows. For them, they could benefit from an equity-like product, but that isn't extractive. So it's non-dilutive, so revenue-based financing is something you hear lately, royalty-based financing. These are products that alternative investors focus on. So it allows us as an impact investor in the nonprofit space, we took in debt and we're able to deploy the range of products to best serve the needs of our small businesses. And the businesses we serve are smaller, right? Some of them are just starting up. In fact, we have one that's a childcare center that's going to be focused on serving lower income children. And the way to get that up and running will take a variety of different instruments at different points in time and heavy technical assistance. So supporting that business, not just with capital, but also knowledge and social capital, which is also part of what we call integrated capital. So it's what we call a full portfolio, full spectrum approach that leverages all types of capital along the spectrum. And for us, that is super important because it's the way that we start to think about closing the racial wealth divide, right? Mm-hmm. So we think about the businesses that we're serving, which are often businesses owned by women or people of color. They start off with less assets, less ability, right, to contribute towards that business. They don't have necessarily the friends and family networks as, say, the majority of our white med businesses. So it is difficult to get them started, and oftentimes they fail in the very early stages. So we come in and are able to provide that heavy TA, the support from a capital perspective, but then also open the doors to different individuals that can help them along the way. The other thing that's unique about our fund is we're looking for impact. So the ESG for us, in the social, let's just say, we're looking at who owns the business. Right? Who has the majority of the ownership? Is it people of color? We look at workers where they have a voice. Do they have the ability to own? So we love models that are worker-owned, cooperatively owned businesses, even businesses with a union. We actually are very attracted to. And then we look at wages. We look at the compensation that individuals are being paid. We look at livable wage versus our minimum wage, and also the spread between the lowest paid worker and the highest paid worker. And along that spectrum also environmental impacts, supply chain, is this business in relationship with its place? Because we want to leverage all aspects of place in order to support that business. So it's a lot that we look at, but it all makes for better investments, but the building of an ecosystem that can start to tackle a lot of the issues of inequality, the issues of support that these businesses need. And in our portfolio now, these businesses are working together. They're buying from each other and lifting each other up.
That's extraordinary. And what I love is the sophisticated approach to a variety of finance tools and helping the nonprofit, which you don't often see in the nonprofit and the social impact world. But also because you're setting these standards for workforce empowerment, workforce wages, you're sort of making it okay for them to compensate their workers and treat their workers in this way because it's a requirement. So there's this whole ripple effect that that is a really beautiful to see. And I'm going to ask you for a specific example in a minute. I would love, Tracy, for you to also give an example. And I think that one of the ones that I've been reading about more recently in the press is your education programs, your skill training programs. So can you explain how that works? Because it's a really innovative program, which again takes the issue that you had of people measuring how many people are enrolled in the class and flipping the model.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. We've done a lot in the last 3 to 4 years in particular around education and training. So if you were to take a step back and think about where can social finance really add value, is where we see systems broken and not delivering value for individuals and workers. So 3 years ago, we started a new tool called the Career Impact Bond. We launched our first Career Impact Bond in 2019, very much focused on IT skills. If you take a step back and look at the American labor force, more than 50% of jobs in the American labor market are what we call middle skills jobs. These are jobs that pay more than a living wage, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year, way north of the average individual income. And these are jobs that don't require a 4-year degree. You need some training, either through a credential or a license beyond a high school GED, but you don't need a 4-year degree. These are jobs in amazing sectors and recession resilient industries like IT, healthcare, the skilled trades. And going back to your earlier point about women, IT is like only a quarter of the IT workforce is populated by women. And if you look at the skilled trades, which is, by the way, growing and so many job openings in the skilled trades, only 8% of construction managers are women. 3% of carpenters, 3% of electricians are women. So, and women can really benefit from these sectors that we're seeing just great job growth in. Yet the training and education system to deliver this kind of labor is kind of broken. If you want to go to a very high quality coding boot camp, and there are several around in the area, General Assembly, Flatiron, Grace Hopper, there are some amazing coding boot camps where you can go in without any college credential, and after 3 to 4 months in a course in software engineering or user interface and design, you can come out of that program with real employable skills, with an employer at the other end catching you for the job market, and start doubling your salary. So we have lots of workers that we're seeing that are making low-wage work, working at food service companies or working at Walmart or Taco Bell, and they go through the training, and in 4 months.
But the hurdle for them was paying for the training.
Exactly, because these programs are not funded by Pell Grants, which are only reserved for Title IV institutions. So when you're a low-income person and you don't have credit to even borrow, and even if you could borrow, why do you want to take on the risk of a loan? So that's where the Career Impact Bond comes in. It removes that upfront financial barrier for people to participate in these high-quality programs. And in addition to tuition support, they also get the important wraparound supports that Betty talked about, because life takes over, right? We have an emergency aid fund for people to meet needs in transportation, childcare, rent. There is a lot of financial literacy coaching, extra job coaching support, and we're seeing extraordinary results. People who are going to boot camps or going to skilled trades, diesel mechanic training program, or a healthcare training program, after 3 to 6 months, whatever the program length is, come out of the other end, landing a great job, typically, doubling their salaries before the program. And this is just an extraordinary time to be launching this work, because there are over 11 million unfilled job openings across America, the highest number since the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, started collecting this data in the year 2000. I always say that it's no longer people looking for jobs, it's jobs looking for people. And it's just a really exciting time to do this. And around a month ago, we announced a $100 million program with Google. This is capital from both Google's balance sheet as well as Google.org, their foundation arm, to launch a program to upskill 20,000 Americans without college degrees to get Google certificates, so that we can hopefully achieve $1 billion in aggregate wage gains. So we're really excited about that, and so that's one vehicle.
So I'm gonna pause there, because the way that you structured it is really, really smart, because you aligned everybody's interests. And so if a person is coming in and wants this and knows that they can't afford the 10 grand or whatever the cost is for the program, they only pay that once they get a job, right? So it's not, instead of the way that it's set up now where it's an upfront cost, it's they're saying, look, there's no risk to you. If you do not get a higher paying job, then you do not have to pay this back.
It's such an important point, and Linda, thanks for bringing it up. So the tool is completely designed for the worker, and it aligns incentives not only between the capital provider and the worker, but also the educational institution. Right now, whether you go to a training program or even go to a 4-year degree institution, they are collecting tuition dollars no matter what happens to the individual. And no wonder we have a ballooning 1.7 trillion student debt crisis held by over 40 million Americans across the country. So the idea that the educational institution has skin in the game, so the coding boot camp actually needs to eat their own cooking. They are actually only going to be made whole with their tuition dollars if people get placed into jobs. So the incentive alignment with the training institution is critical. But even more importantly, the worker needs to be at the center of the entire financial arrangement. Like you said, Linda, if they don't get a good job, and if they don't keep that good job at any given point in time, if their income falls below that income threshold, whether it's 40,000 or 50,000 that we set, they are obligated to pay nothing. So it's completely risk-free for the individual.
It's just so smart. I love that the educating institution as well has the same incentive to make sure that they're providing the right skills and the relevant skills for people to find work. So in studying what your work does as well, you also have a lot of alignment of interest. Can you give us an example of how that works with the work that you do across all of your organizations?
Sure. I mean, the interests are not always totally aligned because we are pushing to create some systemic change, right?
Yeah.
So we're, in the end, are trying to build both worker power, ownership, wealth in communities of color. So there's a bit of redistribution of wealth, which, can be a little bit counter to powers that be. So, but we're very upfront about that, right? So we're trying to build alternative models within the solidarity economy. And I'll give you an example. There's one business that we're almost closed on this investment, an entrepreneur I met in 2019. She had been working for an environmental remediation firm. So in construction, sort of that first piece of the environmental cleanup in a construction site. And knew how to run this business, was at the top, rank of this business, but wasn't allowed to buy a stake in it. So she wasn't going to be made a partner or an owner. And she decided, I've given it my all. It's time for me to now create wealth by owning my own business, and I know this sector. So she launched her own environmental remediation company in 2020, not the best year to start it, but she decided to do upfront that she wanted to be able to pay workers a high wage. She wanted to make sure that they had good benefits. So she created, this is not typical, but she started it off as a union shop, right? So she got the benefit of being a MB, WB, DB, LGBTQ business and union, and is now able to compete for pretty competitive construction jobs. The issue is capital, right? So she has higher labor costs. We love it because she's paying her workers extremely well, great benefits. But within construction, there's a huge payment lag. She needs working capital. And even acquiring the bond to get into the union was a huge challenge, right? So there's this significant capital gap. And our fund was able to provide an investment in her business, a line of credit, so that she can support working capital in order to take on additional contracts. That's going to help her grow, get access to larger firms as well, and she'll be able to take a business, right, that is still like it's doing well, but it has so much potential to grow in terms of number of employees, number of jobs created, and build wealth for those workers, right? Because she's creating a power structure that is allowing them to have a say, but also to build the wages and the wealth in their community. And she employs mostly women workers from the Lawrence area. So she's giving back because she's employing people of color from her own place. So those are the types of things we're looking for. And then what she actually does, right? It's environmental cleanup, it's supporting women in construction, which is an area where we have such a need. And when you think ahead of what's coming, right, both the infrastructure bill, the massive amounts of public dollars coming into the state, and the number of jobs that are going to be created, we don't have enough workers, right? And part of what you're doing is so exciting because you're creating the talent pipeline, but that talent pipeline eventually is in a position to start their own business. That's truly how you build wealth.
That's really exciting, and there's this is such a great conversation because you're doing it on the overall vision is very similar as sort of enabling and empowering people, and you're doing it you're seeing it on sort of really different scales as well in terms of the impact and the effect that it has on communities and on generations. Can you give us, Tracy, another example? So the education program that you had is the one that was one of your more recent. Can you tell us about another one of your programs?
Yeah, Linda, you're familiar with the DACA recipients, or we call them Dreamers. These are Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. These are people who come to our country when they're 4, 5, 6 years old and they've stayed in our country, yet because they're not American citizens, they actually cannot get any of the federal subsidies to go to college. So a year and a half ago, we partnered with Don Graham. You may know Don from this business. Don, since selling the Washington Post, has been passionate about this population. And he started something called Dream.us, which has been an extraordinarily successful nonprofit, sending dreamers on a full ride on a scholarship to get their bachelor's degree. And now there are 8,000, 9,000 of such dreamers who've graduated from the Dream.us program. And many of them, like all of us, they want to get their advanced degrees, their professional degrees. They want to become doctors, dentists, get their MBAs, their JDs. Yet raising scholarship money to send people to graduate school would just be impossible. As successful as Don has been raising hundreds of millions of dollars sending people to go to college. So together, Don and we created a graduate loan program for dreamers going to vetted professional schools. It's around $100 million right now. We plan to grow it over time. And we had our first cohort of students enroll last fall, and we're seeing applications for people enrolling this fall. And we recently got a letter from Homero, who's just this extraordinary young man. He's 23 years old. He enrolled in a medical school in Texas. And he said, my lifelong dream is to be a doctor, and without this program, I could never become a doctor. Why? Because, without citizenship status, and if you go to the private loan market, it's egregious, right? Yeah. And the graduate loan program that we launched with Don is basically saying that if you qualify for this program, you're going to access the exact same interest rates American citizens can get from the federal loan program. So we're just trying to equal the playing field so that everyone can pursue their own American dreams in this country.
One of the things about social finance too is that you have investors. It's not philanthropists, right? It's investors who say, okay, I have the capital. I want my capital to come back with some, but return is not the priority. It's a social impact. So you're talking about these funds that you're raising. So can you talk to us a little bit about the types of people that invest in your funds?
Yeah, as Betty mentioned earlier, there's so much gray area between giving your money away, which we call negative 100%, versus investing in a traditional investment portfolio, getting risk-adjusted market rates of return. And there's a lot of gray space in between. And yes, we're focused on philanthropically motivated investors. So our typical investors across all our deals and funds are program-related investments out of big foundations like the MacArthur Foundation invested in our Career Impact Bond Fund alongside many other national foundations. We also work a lot with donor advised funds. In fact, we are really excited about the promise of using the $200 billion sitting in donor advised funds. These are funds that individuals have already parted with. They've gotten their tax deduction by gifting it to the Fidelity DAF or the Vanguard DAF or the Boston Foundation DAF, yet the money is just sitting there, invested typically in the market, waiting for the donor to give away the money. And we see great promise to really activate that $200 billion sitting on the sidelines for impact investments. So wouldn't it be great that while the money is sitting there waiting to be given away, that they're also generating impact for our communities? So
And increasing the amount of money that they can later
exactly
do.
right. So a lot of our investors are what we call donors making recoverable grants out of their donor advised fund, and it's a major growing segment of our investor base. The other investor base that we work typically with are institutional investors. These are typically investors with a fiduciary duty to actually generate a market rate of return. And we have bankers on our team where we basically tranche the capital stacks to enable that participation of the commercial investor, because we know the power of the capital markets, and we want to make sure that they are part of the capital structure too. So it's just such an exciting time, Linda, to be doing this work. 10 years ago, people were debating what is impact investing, why do we need to do impact investing, and now I think the zeitgeist is that, hey, that's settled. How do we do it well? What are the tools? And it's just a really exciting time to be in the sector.
And a lot more people want it to be part of their portfolio.
Yes.
And how it is. And can you talk about the type of investors that are attracted to your funds as well?
Very, very similar. Yeah. So it's institutional investors as well. Foundations in particular, right, will, and it depends on what bucket, because again, foundations traditionally compartmentalize how they invest. They have their grant dollars, they have their PRIs, program-related investments, and then there are the investments, right? So with the endowments in these foundations, they are investing in venture funds, PE funds, but in the impact funds, which generate a lower rate of return, typically, they don't view those as viable investments, but that is beginning to shift, right? Because if you, again, take a whole portfolio approach, you look at all your investments across, right, grants, PRIs, MRIs, regular investment dollars, and in the end, they generate a holistic return, which is probably very on par, right, for philanthropy. So I think they're starting to rethink how they deploy dollars, and there's a lot of capital right now sitting on the sidelines ready to be deployed into impact type funds, especially those that have a focus on either economic or racial equity. There's a recognition, as you saw from 2020, George Floyd murder, that there's a need to reshift where capital goes. And so you're seeing it both from DAF holders, the donor advised funds that Tracy talked about, from philanthropy, from family offices too, where the next generation is looking at how they're investing their dollars and they want to invest in impact and have a portion allocated to less than market rate return. And then wealthy investors as well. Another unique thing about Boston Impact Initiative is on the investment side or the investor side, we also wanted to open the door for community. So in our fund, we have a tranche of capital that's allocated to community non-accredited investors. Non-accredited meaning they don't meet that SEC threshold, right? But it's really important to open up the door, right, for individuals to be able to invest in a fund. Also, it's not about creating huge wealth, because these are impact funds, but to support the work that is often right in their backyard, because this business that they're supporting may be down the street from them. So there's one business, for example, in our portfolio that is a composting business, and that is right in the community. So community investors are supporting businesses right in their backyard, And for them to ensure that they're getting their money back plus some return, a modest return, is really important to us because, again, it provides some ability to build a little bit of wealth in assets. We're shaping a second fund, which will be a lot larger and, again, has a tranche of community investment so that it allows for, local folks to have participation. The other aspect of that new fund, again, moving dollars into ownership of land is really important as well. So imagine if in your own community there's a development going up and you can buy a piece of the equity stack there, right? Because you often see developers where they're taking over, in the speculative market, they're displacing families, displacing businesses. Well, what if, right, there were models where you could allow community to participate from an ownership perspective, allow them to build wealth, but also prevent displacement at the same time.
You two are so remarkable because you're using just a really sophisticated and thoughtful approach to finance to enable real social impact and doing it in a way that really aligns interests and really includes more people in doing it. What advice do you have for people who are looking to have social impact themselves that maybe aren't quite ready for this level of the scale, but how, you both took a risk. You were both incredibly successful and competent in your careers, and you realized that there was more impact and you really wanted to focus on impact. What advice do you have for people who want to focus on impact?
So I actually think it starts with your everyday actions, right? Buy from a local business, buy from a woman-owned or a business owned by a person of color. Open a door, right? So we underestimate the networks that we have and how opening one door could lead to a new contract, could lead to an amazing sale. It could lead to a mentor that this business needs, or just another woman that's rising up in the ranks and needs sponsorship and championing, right? So I think these individual actions every day make a huge difference. I spend a ton of my time making introductions, opening those doors. Sometimes they lead to new jobs, right? Sometimes it might be just boosting up a woman and telling her you should negotiate your salary, and it can be very transformative if you're paving the way, you're showing up that way, and other people start to replicate that, right? So as part of another nonprofit that I co-founded called Amplify Latinx, we sort of had this motto of lift as you climb, and it is this door opening and championing sponsorship effect, right? That leads to pretty significant movement, right, around getting more women and people of color into what we call positions of power and influence. But it takes a lot of door openers to do that. And it's just everyday simple actions, honestly.
I agree. It's opening doors for others, but sometimes it's also opening door for yourself. And I'm also keen to hear your thoughts too, Linda, because you inspire all of us here. In terms of kind of, the self and allowing yourself to dream a little bit, I mentioned this earlier, Linda, but 12 years ago, I never thought I would have done this. And there's a saying in our family, maybe you've heard this, Linda, is what would you attempt to do if you knew you wouldn't fail? And had I known all the things that could go wrong, I never would have started social finance. So sometimes it's just kind of like this attitude, you know what? It's going to be okay if it doesn't work. Just like go for it and try. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I agree with both of those. So, start, you can do it in your everyday life. Try, you have to actually try. And I also believe in following your bliss. And if it's something that you really, truly care about and are passionate about, then both of you found a way in breaking molds as you did it. This has been just such an inspiring conversation for me. Thank you, both of you, for what you're doing, and then also taking the time to share your story. Because there's so many people that can be inspired and learn new ways of doing things, new ways of helping, and new ways of having impact. So thank you. This has been a joy for me. So thank you. Thank you to PNC Bank for bringing us together today, and thank you to all of you for joining us today.